comes to mind when you hear names like Echo Casemate and Jukebox Lotus? For the U.S. military, it means covert military activity. A new report has uncovered 36 code-named U.S. military operations in Africa. This comes after last year's news that U.S. Special Forces were operating in West Africa's Niger. The only reason most people, including members of Congress, found out was because 4 U.S. troops had died in an ISIS ambush there. Joining us now to discuss, Maurice Carney. He's the executive director of Friends of the Congo. Maurice, good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure to be with you.
So now, as we see here, let's pull up this map. Reporters found out about 36 U.S. military operations in Africa. They had code names, as they're on the screen. This is on top of the extensive military footprint that the U.S. already has in Africa that we do know about. What do you think? Why do you think these code names were given?
Well, it's not really even so much about code names. The best way to look at U.S. military presence on the African continent is to listen to the administration itself, the Trump administration. President Trump and his National Security Advisor, John Bolton, stated that they see Africa as space for great power competition, primarily competing against China and Russia. And when Africa Command was established in 2008, the rationale given by the Bush administration at the time was that they're going to assist Africans with humanitarian missions.
Yeah.
However, as we've seen over the years, that humanitarian mission hasn't been the priority. We see, for example, in Libya, where there was regime change. It was AFRICOM who worked with NATO to lead the bombing on Libya and the overthrow of Gaddafi. And that has exploded instability in the Sahel region of Africa and West Africa. So there's certain things that we can look at over the last 10 years and see what the real intention is of United States military presence on the African continent. It hasn't led to more stability.
Right.
In fact, it has led to increased instability. I mentioned the Sahel region, for example. In addition to that, what we've seen is that U.S. military presence on the African continent has strengthened the hands of authoritarian figures in Africa. If we look at Paul Biya, for example, in Cameroon, where he's an authoritarian figure.
Strongman figures.
Strongman, who has used military to suppress the population. The same, we look in East Africa with Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, who receives hundreds of millions of military support from the United States, used that support to repress its population. So there's certain patterns that we've seen, at least over the last decade, where we've seen U.S. military presence on the African continent has increased.
What about in Sudan, where Omar al-Bashir has finally stepped down? So far, it's been largely peaceful, right? That the people have demanded that he abdicate.
Sudan is an interesting case. There again, we see that the United States just took Sudan off of its sanctions list.
Yes.
Because of strategic reasons. Sudan assisted Saudi Arabia providing support in its military operations in Yemen. As we know, that's one of the greatest humanitarian crises in the world. So wherever we see the U.S. engagement on the African continent, it has resulted in supporting strongmen, it has resulted in instability, and the reasons that are given by the United States for being on the African continent, whether it's for humanitarian reasons or for so-called fighting terrorism, is far from the truth. In fact, the U.S. is on the continent to protect its strategic interests, its access to oil. Some 16% of oil that comes to the U.S. comes out of Africa.
Yeah.
Nigeria,
Angola.
Obviously. Minerals, for example, in the Congo, we see need access to cobalt.
That's exactly your wheelhouse there.
That's our wheelhouse
of the
there.
Congo.
So it's the U.S. presence, the military presence, and the increased presence on the African continent has been as a result of protecting its strategic interests.
And you did mention China and Russia. They're obviously, in this new millennium, they have really put forth a lot of effort there. They're doing a lot of infrastructure, a lot of monetary investments there, giving out loans to people to teach them to prop up their own businesses and what have you. But then you have the U.S. who is there with military presence. Can you kind of discuss how this juxtaposition, how the African continent views that? Because they're viewing Russia and China as helpers, but not so much with the U.S., are they?
Well, the U.S. and Europeans have a long history of colonialism, imperialism, overthrowing democratically elected governments, putting African freedom fighters on terrorist lists like Nelson Mandela. So what we see with the current U.S. presence, it cannot compete with China economically. China's Belt and Road Initiative, and the loans that they've provided in terms of their minerals for infrastructure swap with a number of African countries, U.S. cannot compete. Where the U.S. can compete is with its military. So that's why we see the U.S. increasing its military presence, because it cannot compete with China on the economic plane. However, what it really comes down to is for African interests to be prioritized. It's not so much that Africans are saying, well, we want to side with China or want to side with the U.S. Africans want to establish their own institutions where African interests are prioritized. And the way the United States is approaching Africa does not lend to that.
Yeah, based on history, as we've seen, as you've just laid out for us. As always, Maurice Carney, thank you so much for such an in-depth insight on all of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.